Vision Christian Radio, Neil Johnson with you. It's the Tuesday edition of 2020 and a fascinating conversation coming over this next hour. Shortly, we'll open our talkback lines, your opportunity to join in. You might have a question, a comment, even a critique for the conversation, but it will be a fascinating conversation. I think we can promise that. If you've ever thought you'd like to trace your family tree, get ready. Our special guest today is an avid genealogy fan who has traced his ancestry back to Adam and Eve. He's also an authority on the dispersion of people groups around the world after the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. Well, Bodie Hodge is a speaker, a writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. His expertise is as a mechanical engineer, has a master's degree. He's authored numerous articles and book chapters from Answers in Genesis and has served as general editor on the World Religions and Cults and Glasshouse Books. Bodie also regularly appears as a host on Answers News and frequently speaks at the Creation Museum and Ark Encounter on topics such as dinosaurs and dragons and the dispersion at Babel and the biblical response to racism. So from Answers in Genesis, a special welcome along to Bodie Hodge. Bodie, welcome along to 2020.
Hey, it's great to be on.
Bodie, just a little about your connections here for a few moments before we get into the conversation. You're connected there with Answers in Genesis, and I mentioned your roles there in presenting some of those programs, but how long is it now you've had this connection?
Oh boy, I've been here at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis for about 20 years, and it's been exciting. Like I said, I'm a mechanical engineer. I used to work in industry. I used to teach at a university. I used to teach at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. So I really enjoyed all that, but it's been wonderful going into ministry. I love getting into God's Word and being able to train people and just dive into those extra subjects like the Tower of Babel or dinosaurs and dragons. It really is a neat and fun subject.
And your own story, very briefly, on becoming a creationist, because, oftentimes people say people who are earning higher degrees or working in science industries, sometimes they've got difficulties with a creationist position, but how's your development along those lines gone?
Well, I grew up in church and, I got saved when I was 9 years old, but I really didn't grow extensively in my faith. I heard gospel sermons all the time and I loved it. But I really struggled, especially by the time I got to college. I remember someone asked me a question. He said, "Hey, who came first? Was it David or Abraham?" And I remember my response was, "Boy, I don't know. I could tell you all about David. I could tell you all about Abraham, but I didn't put it together apologetically. I didn't put it together historically." And that was just kind of a taste of where I was when I was in college. What I really needed was answers. And I ended up getting some answers. It was a couple of years after that. But boy, when I started to get some answers, I got excited about my faith. I said, you know what? I want more answers. And I really started diving into this. So I really solidified my belief in six-day creation, a global flood, God creating everything. I really solidified that belief system, there toward the end of my college years. And I think, the Lord just opened doors for me to really grow in that.
Have you discovered over the years, and you say you've got this 20-year history with Answers in Genesis, and you've spoken to an awful lot of groups in that time, that people have difficulty appreciating the genealogies that we can read in the scriptures that take us right back to Adam and Eve? What are your thoughts on how people feel and what people think and the sorts of feedback you might be getting along those lines?
Well, if you're anything like I am, or a lot of the people out there, tuning in, you're probably one of those people who go, "Oh boy, let's read the Bible." And you get to that section and you see all those genealogies and those names. You go, "Oh Lord, please don't let that be me that has to read those out loud in front of everyone." I used to be kind of like that too. But you know what? Those genealogies are actually amazing. Just take, for example, the ones in Genesis chapter 5. Those are all of our direct ancestors right there, from Adam to Noah. And then you go after the Tower of Babel, you get into Genesis chapter 10, Genesis chapter 11 picks back up with some more. But you look at those, our direct ancestors are up there, and we're related to all those people. And what really blew my mind was to realize that people have been researching this and keeping track of ancient genealogies essentially in places all over the world. And when you can say, okay, this people group came out of this group, or this people group came out of this descendant or grandson or great grandson of Noah, it gets exciting. I remember when I was down in Peru, down in South America, and we had a translator down there, and I was talking about different peoples that went all over the place. Of course, they were really excited when I started talking about, like where the Spanish came from, because the Spanish came in to Peru, and there's been a lot of intermixing going on there, a lot of history there. But when I was able to talk to them about the people groups that made it into the Iberian Peninsula where Spain was at, and this is the majority of the people, the Castilian people, they came out of Tubal. I'll tell you what, they just stopped. They're like, tell us that again. They were really excited about it because in their mind, they're like, okay, yeah, we're related to Noah. But when you can actually say, okay, we go through this line to Noah, it helps make the Bible come alive. It gets real for them. And they were really excited about it. And I've seen that with people all over the world, just chatting with them when I find out their history.
We're all fascinated a little, aren't we? Because when we've got an idea of where our family has come from, then we are identified with that family, and perhaps we're identified with the strengths and with the weaknesses, because there might be all sorts of skeletons in the closet. Some people might not even find their own family genealogy, but there is something in the belonging that we have when we understand where we fit in the family. How does that work, do you think, if you can actually connect your own ancestry with these biblical genealogies?
Well, I think it's really powerful. I think you hit the nail on the head with that. When you can connect with a particular people group that goes right back to one of Noah's sons, grandsons, or great grandsons, and so forth, that really does help everything come alive. You do feel a connection there. For example, I'm actually related to the royal family of England, and if you think of that family, it's intermarried with several other royal families, and you can go back to some of the Scottish royalty. You can go back, obviously, a lot of the English royalty, and some of this interconnects. It's really exciting. From my perspective, when I first found that, I was just blown away. Now, at the same time, I've got some German, I got some Irish, I got, of course, obviously some English. When I started looking at it, I got some Scottish, I got some French Norman, I got some Swedish, I got some Italian in there, I got some Native American, I got Portuguese. I'm kind of a mutt. That's how a lot of us Americans are over here. We're kind of intermixed. But it's neat when I can see those different lines and where they came from. I may not be able to track all those lines, but I know that I came out of this people group. And according to the historical records, or in some cases, direct biblical records, we can trace it to a particular son or grandson. It really is neat. So, yeah, there is a connection in there, good or bad. There is a really neat connection in it.
Not all of us might be able to claim that we're connected to the British royal family, and that's quite a claim to fame. But when you eventually take your genealogy and your family tree connections back to a significant family where there is that significant genealogical history, that is actually where you can start to trace the roots right back to biblical times. Would that be the key if you can actually get onto that pathway?
Yeah, I think that's really one of the routes. When you can tie into a lot of the royal families, so many of them have lines that go right back to one of Noah's sons, grandsons, or great grandsons, and that's the case with, the Queen of England, or now the King of England. We have that connection that goes back, right back, to Noah, and and when you think historically, there's a lot of these different cultures that kept track of the king's list, and the ones that were close or nearby, they kept track of these sorts of things as well, because they're vying for a crown, especially in different regions, and as people different marry across, you got potential bloodlines that lead to other royals throughout Europe and different other places, but sometimes the commoners didn't have as many records. A lot of those records were kept in churches, and, they're deciphering a lot of those. And so, in some of my cases, I can go back to the 1300s, the 1500s, but sometimes they run into a dead end in some of those. But yeah, when I got the one that tied into the royal genealogies, I'm like, okay, that's really neat. That was pretty exciting for me.
Well, so many of us might have had some sort of family genealogical compiling, and yes, you get to a point where things exhaust and nobody knows where to go further. So that's going to be a challenge for each of us. We're going to come back and talk more about genealogies, but I also want to talk to you about another dimension here, which has such amazing impact on our understanding of what's happened around the world, and that is, of course, the biblical account of the Tower of Babel. Now, give us some insight here, because you've written a book on this, because we're talking not only about languages, we're talking about then developing skin colours and differences and the dispersal of people groups from around the world. Any thoughts here on the value of understanding the Tower of Babel?
Right. There's so much, not just historically, but also archaeologically, just so people can track with us. Big picture, God creates everything in 6 days. It was a perfect creation. We expected nothing less from a perfect God. Because of man's sin, death and suffering came into the world. That's why we need a Savior to save us from sin and death. But then, we have this flood about 1,600 years or so after God created everything. And that, of course, rearranged continents, shifted things around. Now, what's significant is after the flood, only 8 people survived the flood, Noah and his family. And God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. But what we saw was the descendants of Noah came together and they said, let's build a city, let's build a tower, let's not be scattered. They tried to defy God's command on that, and God wasn't going to let them get away with it. And so he came down and he, in a very gentle way, he actually confused their languages so that scattered them to go to different parts of the world. Now, that scattering split apart the gene pool. And as people go to different parts of the world, the gene pool is now split apart. People who ended up in Scandinavia took genes for lighter skin. People who ended up in Africa took genes for darker skin. People went to the Orient, took genes for more of an almond-shaped eye. But I want people to understand we're all related. We all go back to Noah. We all go back to Adam, which means there's only one race, and that is the human race. And, back in old dictionaries, it used to say Adam's race. We're all part of that human race, no matter what we look like, which means we're all sinners. We're all in need of Jesus Christ, regardless of how we look. I look at different people around the world and, I say, wow, how do they have such a good full head of hair? Here I am struggling, losing my hair. But we're all related. So somewhere out there, somebody's got the genes for the hair. I've lost those. But, that's just a taste of the peoples. Now, if we shift over to the archaeology, which is just another fascinating subject, we know where Babel was. And archaeologically, they've been digging that out ever since about 1899. It was Koldewey, a German archaeologist, that actually started to lead that research. Now, for the last 100 years or so, a lot of the Germans have been the ones who have been digging things up and documenting all that. So a lot of us English speakers are kind of been left out in the cold. Well, recently, Professor George, he was a professor there in London, England, as I recall, and he translated a lot of the information, a lot of what these archaeologists have been doing. And I was pretty excited when I read that particular article because, they were talking about 3 different bases where the tower actually stood. And, there, if you, search for this, even on Google Earth, you can go down and see the archaeological remains. You can see the footprint where the tower was. And of course, it's been rebuilt, torn down, and all sorts of things over the years. And we have a lot of records of that. But it was neat to see those 3 different bases, which gives us a pretty good idea of how big the tower was. Pretty good sized structure.
Well, we're talking genealogies, we're talking the Tower of Babel, we're also talking about the dispersal of people around the earth. You might have a question, you might have a comment, you might have a critique for the conversation. We're going to talk some more with our very special guest, Bodie Hodge, who's a speaker, writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. We're back with more in just a few moments, and our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You might have a question about genealogies, about biblical history, about the book of Genesis and the way the history begins to unfold, the dispersal of nations around the world after the Tower of Babel and the confusion of languages. Well, you're welcome to call us on 1-800-316-316. Bodie Hodge is our guest, speaker, writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. Before we take any calls, Bodie, let me ask you about the evolutionary model, which is a model that takes in millions of years. versus the genealogy model from the Bible, which obviously is a shorter time. I wonder if you've got an opinion about how the facts fit the genealogy model of the Bible, and perhaps they don't fit the evolutionary model. Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, boy, that's a big question, and there's a lot to talk about there. Here's one of the things that I've particularly noticed over the years. When we start with the Bible, we get 6-day creation, you get the genealogies, you just don't get millions and billions of years out of it. If you reject the Bible, all of a sudden God is no longer seen as the absolute authority. And what that means is man's ideas have been elevated to supersede God. That is a form of humanism. And that's what's happening in our culture. When you see millions and billions of years, you see evolutionary ideas supersede God and his word. The religion of humanism is essentially being preached, and it's the secular forms of humanism that we're seeing dominate in our culture. So really what it is, it's actually a battle over two different worldviews, two different religions, and it's an authority issue. When you think about God and his word, there is no greater authority than God. So when someone rejects God and his word, by what authority can they actually object to God? What they're doing, they're actually appealing. This is a fallacy. They're appealing to fallible, imperfect human beings to try to supersede God. That is a faulty appeal to authority fallacy. That's what's happening. So there's a battle over that. Now, here's the thing, too. When you start with the Bible, God created everything in 6 days, rested on the seventh. This is not a problem for an all-powerful God. It is a secular religion that a lot of people have bought into or been duped into believing that has caused them to buy into these ideas of millions and billions of years. This is geological evolution or biological evolution, that man evolved from ape-like creatures. And if you go back far enough, it's a single-celled organism. Now, when you actually look at Earth history, there's a battle, and this battle is raging over the rock layers. The rock layers are the source of that debate. In the secular world, they assume that those rock layers were laid down slowly and gradually over millions and billions of years. As a Christian, I'm starting with the Word of God. And I see a global flood where a massive worldwide flood occurred over the course of about a year, and that's what laid down the vast majority of those rock layers. Of course, we've had rock layers since that time, but most are from the flood. So we're looking at the same evidence. It's not a battle over creationist evidence versus evolutionary evidence. It's a battle over the same evidence. The difference is the interpretation. And I'm going to start with the Word of God when I look at any piece of evidence, including those rock layers. So that's just a taste of that debate, taste of that argument that's going on out there. In fact, a lot of people who are listening right now, they might be excited to know that we're going to have a conference down in the Brisbane area. This is going to be June 30th through July 1st. Ken Ham is going to be there, and Dr. Georgia Purdom. She is a geneticist here at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis. And we're also going to have Martin Isles. So we're pretty excited about that. This is Divided Nation, and it's looking at the culture in chaos. What can the church do? So Ken Ham, Dr. Georgia Purdom, Martin Isles in the Brisbane area. This will be June 30th and July 1st. And they're going to be dealing with a lot of these subjects. I want to encourage people to come out for that. We're going to have a little bit more information on our website this coming week, just to let everybody know more about that.
We'll mention those dates again before the end of our conversation. Let's take a call or two before news. Cindy is in Benalla in New South Wales. Hello, Cindy. Welcome along.
Hi. I was watching a program recently, and they reckon in 2013 they excavated a woolly mammoth, and it had fur on its trunk. And because it was frozen in Antarctica, it never thawed to decay, so it's still got red meat on it, and they want to make 100 clones out of it. Do you think that's going to happen?
Okay, good thoughts there, Cindy. So woolly mammoths preserved in the I guess it's the permafrost. They become uncovered. Yeah. The possibility of cloning those woolly mammoths. What are your thoughts for Cindy?
That's interesting. These are actually creatures that came off of the ark. They're part of the elephant kind, and as animals were redistributing over the earth, this is one of the variations of that particular elephant kind. Yeah, we've got quite a few of those that have been buried in the permafrost, probably dust storms after the flood. Particularly after the Ice Age, as these things have started to get pretty populated out there. That's an interesting question, though, about cloning those. Under the Dominion mandate, we do have the right to do different sets of research on animals and that sort of thing. So it'd be kind of interesting to see. Now, these are part of the elephant kind. So if you think about it, when you see other elephants, they're all part of that same kind. Now, it's not the same species. I want you to understand that. Sometimes we throw this word species out here. It's more of a modern term that we use. But a good rule of thumb for a kind is if things could interbreed with each other, they're part of the same kind. So you have Asian elephants, African elephants, they could ultimately interbreed with each other. Most likely mastodons, mammoth, those sorts of things would have been part of that kind. Now, Mike Ord has actually written a book on this subject called Frozen in Time, and really looks at woolly mammoths from a biblical viewpoint, dealing with a lot of that different evidence. And you can find access to that book, or at least some of the chapters on our website, ancestrygenesis.org. So hopefully you can find that, and a neat subject, though.
There's places you can find answers. Cindy in Benalla, thank you so much for your call. I'm just going to take one more before news. Steve is in Riverview in Ipswich, Queensland. Hi, Steve. Welcome.
Hi, Neil. How you going?
Good. Need to be quick, Steve. What's your question or your comment?
Yep. I've heard a Bible teacher go saying that some of the genealogies, there's gaps between saying he was the son of and he's actually like the great-grandson or something like that. Can you comment on that, please?
Bodie, gaps in genealogies.
Yeah, we deal with that actually in our Answers book, Volume 1. If you hop on the website, ancestrygenesis.org, type in gaps in the genealogies, we do take a look at that. I've heard that kind of claim as well. But when you actually look at the ones in, say, Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11, it's giving you all the chronological data from father to son. So in those particular instances, we're not seeing any instance where it is a grandson. In fact, you got to be very careful when you tally those up. Otherwise, you start having people go beyond the flood without being on the ark. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Does that also, there's also the gap theory, in Job, where it says about that the earth was there and then God created and there was a big gap before he actually created man. There's a gap theory going around about,
We might have to wait until after news to be able to tackle the gap theory. Undoubtedly, there's a longer answer than we've got because we're about to break for news. Steve will try and tackle that after Vision National News. Steve, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is Bodie Hodge, speaker, writer and researcher with Answers in Genesis. AnswersInGenesis.org, and you'll find those opportunities to ask questions and access a database of fabulous information about all the sorts of things you might be talking about. AnswersInGenesis.org. We're back with more after Vision National News. Wonderful to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. And if you're just joining us, joining into a fascinating conversation about genealogies, tracing a genealogy back to Adam and Eve. If you ever thought you'd like to trace your family tree, get ready. You might have a question to ask, a comment to make, even a critique for the conversation. That's welcome too. Our special guest is an avid genealogy fan who has traced his ancestry back to Adam and Eve. He's also an authority on the dispersion of people groups around the world after the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis. Bodie Hodge is a speaker, writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. That's the creation organisation led by Australian creationist Ken Ham. Bodie has a master's degree in mechanical engineering. He's authored numerous articles and book chapters for Answers in Genesis. And he's a regular on Answers News, frequently speaking at the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter in Kentucky in the US on topics like dinosaurs and dragons, the dispersion at Babel, and the biblical response to racism. Bodie, before we take some more calls, just coming back to our caller before the news, and that was Steve in Riverview in Ipswich, who was asking about the gap theory, the thought that somehow or other there's a gap in the very first verse of the Bible. What's your response when that question comes up?
Well, the gap theory was actually a response to this idea millions of years. When people started to throw the Bible out and reject a global flood, and they came up with this idea of long ages, sometimes Christians didn't know what to do with it. And Thomas Chalmers in the early 1800s said, hey, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take all that millions of years and I'm just going to put it between Genesis 1:1 and 2 so I don't have to worry about it. And that became known as gap theory. So they said, between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, there's all this millions of years, and maybe the earth was then recreated. Maybe that's when Satan or Lucifer had fallen. And that was actually a very popular view that really spread. I'd say by the 1840s, a lot of Christians had bought into that. But what they'd done is they essentially had rejected a global flood. Now then, flood in, you got a problem, because if the rock layers are evidence of millions of years and you have a global flood's going to tear up those rock layers and lay down new ones. So you do run into some problems. A couple of other problems is, let's just say, for example, that Satan or Lucifer fell between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. Well, Genesis 1, verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. If that's the case, that would make Satan in his sinful state very good. In fact, that would make sin very good. Those are huge theological problems. Another really big problem that people hadn't thought through is, if these rock layers were evidence of millions and billions of years, and we're going to put those right back there between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, then that means that God declared all the death that we see in those rock layers, and the cancer and the tuberculosis and the thorns and animals eating other animals, all that would also be declared very good. Deuteronomy 32:4 says every work of God is perfect. What we expected was a perfect creation, not one marred with death, bloodshed, and suffering. We need to remember that death, bloodshed, and suffering came in after Adam and Eve sinned against God. That's when God cursed the ground, cursed the animals, and sentenced man to die. What we see are evidence of the flood of Noah's day. We expect to see death in there and suffering and thorns, because those were laid down after Adam and Eve sinned against God. We do have a chapter on our website, answersingenesis.org. Just type in gap theory. Several of them will pop up. There's some really good ones on there.
We're taking calls on 1-800-316-316. Let's hear from Graham in Tasmania. Hi, Graham. Welcome along.
Hello, gentlemen. My question is, what happened to the tribes that didn't go back to Israel after the 70 years? Could you give me an idea who those tribes are today?
Okay, Bodie, is this, so tribes, when you're talking about the 70 years, you're talking about an exile, you're talking about those tribes, or are we talking about tribes that go back into the early part of Genesis?
I apologise for that. In other words, Israel, when Israel's taken out of by Babylon and such, and Assyria, those 10 tribes of Israel, do you know where they'd be today? Is that easier?
Bodie, is that in your ability to respond?
I might be able to give a basic answer, but others may know a little bit more than I would on this subject. But just so people know, Assyria, which was a very evil nation, actually came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. This is after Solomon. We had a number of kings in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Assyria was taken by judgment, the northern kingdom there, and so that was essentially 10 of the tribes were taken back. Later on, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, which encompassed essentially 2 tribes. But all those tribes that the Assyrians had taken over, the Babylonians now controlled them as well. What's interesting is, after that 70 years, when the Israelites were permitted to go back to the land, we think of Ezra and Nehemiah, the strife of rebuilding the wall. That was during the time of the Persians. Sometimes people said, well, where did all these tribes go? Well, actually, quite a few of them, we have representatives of them coming back to Israel, and were living in the land leading up to around the time of Christ. However, some of them had intermarried, were dispersed and intermixed with some of those different peoples there in the Middle East. But, beyond some of the specifics at that point, I don't know if I could venture too much more into that one.
Well, Graham, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today, because it's one thing to talk about what happens to the tribes of Israel, but what we're talking about, I guess, when you take the history right back to the Tower of Babel and back to the flood and back to Adam and Eve, you're talking about what happens with the dispersal of people groups, and not just the Israelites, but all sorts of other people groups in those, as you mentioned, the Assyrian nations. They must have actually come from a particular lineage there too. So the dispersal of peoples and taking that back to the Tower of Babel, because that's the place where God decided to disperse the people because confusion of the languages. Come back to, just before we take another call, to this Tower of Babel, because a lot of people think this is somehow mythological and never did exist. It's something that was created in a vibrant imagination. What are your thoughts for this Tower of Babel?
Well, a lot of people are deceived into that, I believe. If you were to type in Tower of Babel on the internet, one of the first things that pop up is Wikipedia that says it's a mythological tower. If you find Encyclopedia Britannica, guess what? They say it's a mythological tower as well. Of course, the Bible disagrees with them on this particular subject, and God's the one that's always right. But it is a real place. You can actually find archaeological remains for it, even the tower, its platform. So we do actually have quite a bit of history of this tower going all the way back, almost to the time of Hammurabi, maybe even a little bit before there. So there are records of this tower. Just so people understand, the tower doesn't stand today. It's gone through its rebuilding phases and expansions and so forth, and Nebuchadnezzar was one of the people known for that. But one of the last iterations of it was Alexander the Great. When he came in and conquered Babylon in that area, he saw this tower. It was in dire need of repair. What he decided to do was tear it down and have it rebuilt. So he gave the order. It was torn down, but then he died an early death. He actually died in Babylon, by the way. And the tower was then never rebuilt. And so its foundation was left in ruin up until it was excavated and people started digging some of that out. But, some other aspects of the Tower of Babel, yes, we got all sorts of archaeological finds, but here's something that really will fascinate. The names of Noah's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons are actually found all over the world. And it surprises people to know this. Of course, there's variations in some of these particular names. Let me just give you a handful just to whet your appetite on this. For example, the ancient name for Germany, and the Jews still use this name, is Ashkenaz. And some of the variant names of Ashkenaz is Ascandinavia or a Saxon. So the name Saxon and the name Ashkenaz are actually variations of Noah's great-grandson Ashkenaz. If you think of the Chinese, a lot of the Chinese, there's about 30 different ethnic groups in China. One of those particular groups dominated many of the others, and that was a group of Sinites. And they still use that name even to this day. When China and Japan went to war, it was called the Sino-Japanese War. We still see a reflection of that name. The Hebrew name for Greece is Javan. That's one of Noah's grandsons. The Hebrew name for Egypt is Mitzrayim. And, the Jews still use that name. That's one of Noah's grandsons. So we still see a reflection of these names in many parts of the world. And that's just a taste of it. But it really is neat. Great confirmations of what we see in Scripture.
Let's take another call. Philip is in Albany in WA. Hi, Philip. Welcome.
Good morning. Just another possible way of looking at these matters. Hard evidence. Valleys in the sea. There is a obscure verse in the Bible talking about valleys in the sea. Well, who can, determine if they're down there or not? Well, I did the orca whale tour at the Bremer Canyon just yesterday. Now, the canyon is 1,000 metres deep. It's carved into the edge of the continental shelf, and it's 50 kilometres off the current shoreline. Now, if the Bible was true about receding floodwaters and that process from the time of the flood, then I think we'd expect to see these valleys in the seas, these canyons, around every continent in the world. And you just go onto Google Earth and you can see the satellite imaging of these massive 1,000-metre deep canyons outside every river system on planet Earth.
Wonderful insight there, Philip. What's your response, Bodie?
you know what, when the floodwaters are coming off, of course, we're going to get all sorts of erosional features. First, there's sheet erosion, and then there's what's the channeling. And of course, we see the channeling on the continents. We also see it, as the water is starting to go out off those continental shelves and so forth, as the mountains rising, the valleys are sinking down. Psalm 104 verses 8 and 9 kind of give us some hints at that. That particular psalm starts off with creation, transitions to the flood, then transitions post-flood, and it's talking about the mountains rising and the valleys sinking down. And of course, it alludes to that promise that God gave at the end of the flood, that he would never again flood the entire earth as he did Noah's day to destroy all life. So yeah, we expect to see those types of things. I think those are great confirmations, actually, what we would expect from what we call catastrophic flood models and things like that. So yeah, I think that's a pretty neat piece of evidence.
Philip, thank you so much for your call. That leads into something I was hoping to just raise, and in between some of the calls, when you've got dispersions that come after the Tower of Babel, you've got movement of tectonic plates. As our guest, our caller said, you've got the way that floodwaters around nations have formed even those valleys in the sea. You've got the thoughts of modern ice ages, the formation of ice bridges, the things that facilitate the movement of people and of animals around the world. I mean, that's a huge, big issue, but have you got any, sort of insight into the way those sorts of dispersions might be in our minds, that we can make sense of those?
Yeah, I like to look at that kind of from a big picture. If you actually look at like the continental scheme, I believe it was Antonio Snyder back in the 1800s. He was a creationist that suggested, the continents split apart during the flood of Noah's day, and it took a lot of years, but a lot of people now are going, oh yeah, guess what? The continents were moving, and we still see residual effects of that now. Now you have to understand, in today's culture, they're not thinking in terms of a flood and catastrophic movements. They're thinking in terms of slow and gradual. So they see what we have today, slow, gradual movements, and they just want to extrapolate that back into the past for millions of years. But, I'm thinking in terms of a global flood, continental shifting, the springs of the great deep burst forth there in the book of Genesis, and that's going to cause the splitting of these continents is going to cause shifting and pulling and movement, and we call this catastrophic plate tectonics. Where some things are actually being pulled and rapidly subducting and moving some of these continents. Of course, there's a lot of aspects of these different models. I'm trying to keep it big picture here. What we know is the mountains of Ararat were made by the 150 a day of the flood. We think of the arc striking the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat are kind of right in the middle between the Eurasian plate, the African plate, the Arabian plate, and the Indo-Australian plate kind of colliding to push up those mountains. So by the 150 a day, I'd suggest that there was actually a fair amount of continental shifting that had occurred. Now, of course, we still see residual effects in early post-flood. There's probably quite a bit of things going on. But you also mentioned the Ice Age. Now, the Ice Age is a really neat subject. The Ice Age would have been triggered by the flood of Noah. An Ice Age is a unique event. I want people to understand, if you just cool the Earth off, you don't get an Ice Age. You just get a cold globe. What you need for an ice age is you need to have warm oceans and cool summers. That's the key. Warm oceans, cool summers. Warm oceans mean you get a lot more evaporation and a lot more snowfall in the wintertime. And cool summers means it doesn't get hot enough to melt all that off, so you're still left with some. So the following year you get more. So warm oceans from catastrophic plate movements, volcanism from the flood. We expect the waters to be a bit warmer at the time of the flood, particularly thereafter. And the other thing is, when volcanoes go off, and we expected there to be a lot of volcanism as a result of continental shifting, it leaves little particulates and dioxins and things like that in the upper atmosphere, and that reflects some of the sunlight back. It actually cools summers. So the flood is actually an ideal mechanism to trigger the flood of Noah's day. So yes, creationists and evolutionists both have an ice age. We have one major ice age triggered by the flood. They have a whole bunch that go back for alleged millions of years. So that's a really neat subject. Of course, we have stuff on our website about that. Type in catastrophic plate tectonics or the flood, or type in ice age. You can find a lot of answers on the website answersingenesis.org.
We're taking calls. Let's take another one. Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hi, Richard. Welcome.
G'day, guys. I had two questions, sort of a one-part question, but just in two questions. Retaining to climate change, and like you were talking about evolution and all that sort of stuff, wouldn't a prerequisite for climate change be the basis of evolution?
What's your thoughts here,
Not
Bodie?
necessarily. I mean, if we sit back and think about this, when God created everything, it was perfect. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve sinned against God, God cursed the ground. At that point, God is no longer upholding the world in a perfect state. He's still upholding it, of course, and sustaining it all, but it's not held in a perfect state. We see massive climate change at the time of the flood of Noah's day. We've seen climates adjust and change and try to right itself as you go through the ice age. So yeah, we actually expect to see fluctuations and changes like that. It's not dependent upon a secular worldview. Now, if you look at this from a secular viewpoint, you got to think of the way they're looking at the past. They've assumed that we haven't had an ice age for 10,000 years. And so they assume that climate has just been steady, steady, steady. And then we see some of these little micro changes, 1/10 of a degree, and people go, oh no, what did we do? We have to be very careful of that because that's based on a worldview. And that's where you have to be very careful. So that's just a small taste of it. Type in climate change on the website. You'll get a lot of stuff that pops up on that.
Richard in Alstonville, thank you so much for your call. Let's take another one. Michael is in Moruya in New South Wales. Hi, Michael. Welcome.
Hi, Neil and Bodie. Bodie, you mentioned a while ago about with the Tower of Babel. God sent the people to different parts, and they had different coloured skin in the different parts and different shaped eyes. How did that happen? Did God change the colour of their skin and the shapes of their eyes?
A good question, Michael. Bodie,
that's
your
a great
thoughts?
question, yeah. Yeah, really what it is has to do with our genetics. So God has designed us in such a way that we actually have a vast variation within our skin tone, within our eye shape, within how much hair we have or whatever it might be. We've been conditioned in a culture to look at certain things, though, and that's one of the things we've got to be very careful of. For example, in our culture, people are taught to try to separate out the human race and try to get multitudes of higher and lower races based on things like skin tone and so forth. Now, that actually comes out of an evolutionary worldview. But when we look at, let's just look at skin tone for just a moment. Skin tone, it all depends on, do you have more melanin in your skin or do you have less melanin in your skin? People who are darker have more. People who don't have near the darkness in there, they have less melanin. Melanin is a pigment that appears in your skin. There's actually two forms of it. But your genetics tell you how much to produce of that. And as the filtering of the population goes out, some people are going to produce more, some people are going to produce less. And there's a great example. There's a couple of twins, and I use this in a lot of my talks. These are the Hoarder twins. Both of the parents are more middle brown, and both of them had a light and dark parent. They both came out middle brown, and they were twins to those two. And those two twins, one is blonde hair, blue eye, fair skin. The other is dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes. And they are twins. And you can tell they're twins. It's just their tone and their eyes have that little bit of variation in there. So that's actually not a problem. There's still one race, the human race, but it has to do with our genetics. So that's what it comes down to, the combinations that we get.
Michael in Moruya, thank you so much for your call, and time is running short. Coming back to genealogies for a few moments, and the fascination that there is that we have with making our family tree and finding out where we come from, getting an identity from the good, the bad, and the ugly things that we might find. You've traced your genealogy and you've connected at a point where you recognise that you're actually related distantly to the British royal family. And so you've got this genealogy that can go right back to first century. And once you get back to first century, you connect your genealogy to a biblical genealogy, and you can go all the way back to Noah and all the way back to Adam and Eve. So for people who are looking to do some more searching in their own genealogies, how do you go about that? I'm not an expert in this area.
Well, first off, you start with your own close relatives. Hey, how far can we go back? There's usually somebody in the family, and I got some people on both sides that actually enjoy genealogies. It was a great uncle of mine that had probably did most of the legwork that connected us to the royal family. And as soon as he told me he had it from the royal family, I got excited because, I'd done all this research from Adam and Eve down to Noah, down to all these different people groups and where they went and all these different kings lists, and I'm like, wow, the Queen of England has this line, and then he's like, we're related to the Queen of England, and here's how. I was like, oh, okay, let's connect these. And so we got together and we got all this figured out. So that was actually really neat. Now, there are websites like ancestry.com and jenny.com. You can actually trace a certain amount, and you can pay into those and actually do some pretty serious research, and they go back as far as you can on those. It just happened to be on one of mine. We got tied in, and I go back to Edward the Longshanks, not his first son, but another one of his sons, and Thomas Earl of Norfolk, and that's actually where my line comes from. So we actually split off from the royal family right about there, but it does go back quite a ways.
Well, it's a challenge, and there might be listeners who might want to to trace their genealogy back. Now, just one quick question as we're talking genealogies, dispersal of nations, those sorts of things. If you do a connection of your own genealogy, and you can take it to the connection to one of those significant, perhaps royal families, and you can trace your genealogy right back through first century, back to Noah, back to Adam and Eve, what do you think something like that might do for your own family's perception of who you are? Is there something significant that happens? I mean, you have your own family experience. What do your family members think of the fact that you've traced your genealogy back that long and got it connected? What's the significance?
That's a great question. I'm actually glad you asked that question. I remember when I was talking to some of my family, I'm like, you guys aren't going to believe this, but look at this, and I was pretty excited about it. And, obviously my believing family was like, oh, this is really neat. Let me check it out. They want to look, and they're, they thought that was kind of neat. But, I've got some relatives that are more, not necessarily, following Christ. Some of them are struggling with some of these things, and you point that out and they're like, oh, really? Yeah. Are you sure? And I've got all the references documented there. But you know what? Here's what I found. It makes for a great conversation piece to talk to people about the Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Because, think about this. Since I go back to Noah, guess what? That means I'm related to Jesus Christ as well. Technically, he is my cousin, and he's your cousin. He stepped into history to become a man, to take on flesh, and now we're all related to Christ. He is our kinsman redeemer. Imagine witnessing that way, say, hey, let me tell you about my cousin. He died and he resurrected on the third day. And you know what? Easter's right around the corner. And, it's exciting to think about what the Lord and Savior has done for us. And I want people to understand, when Jesus Christ died on that cross, the infinite Son of God took the infinite punishment that we all deserve for our sin. Only he was in a position to do that. The infinite Son took that infinite punishment from the infinite Father. And that was enough to satisfy God's wrath upon sin. That's what makes salvation possible, through the blood of Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection. And what I love about that is Jesus Christ lived a perfect life without sin, and now his righteousness can be transferred to us. When we believe in Jesus Christ and we place our faith and our trust in the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, his righteousness is transferred. That's called imputed to us, so that on Judgment Day we are seen as spotless as Jesus Christ before a holy God.
Well, Bodie Hodge, there's so much more to talk about. I'm sure there's a lot of listeners who thought they might have been able to get a call in, but we might make another appointment on another day, and there's lots of dimensions to your own life that I'd love to explore too, and we won't go into those right now. But Bodie Hodge, speaker, writer and researcher for Answers in Genesis. To connect with Bodie, AnswersInGenesis.org. And Bodie is also the author of the book Tower of Babel, The Cultural History of Our Ancestors. He also mentioned, too, a tour. Ken Ham, Dr. Georgia Purdom, and Australia's own Martin Isles, speaking June 30th through July 1st, a conference in Brisbane called Divided Nation. So you'll be able to find some details, no doubt, too, on the Answers in Genesis website, AnswersInGenesis.org. Bodie, thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with us today on 2020.
It's been great to be on. God bless you and keep up the great work.